James cleverly comes back, big beast, former Foreign Secretary, former Home Secretary. In his first interview, he basically disagrees with Kemi and says we shouldn't leave the ECHR.
4.
The British public have been pretty angry with immigration for a really long time.
3.
I looked into the history and it turns out to be complete bunkum.
2.
Well, we have a big problem, which is we let the country down.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with me, Liam Halligan, and ordinarily Alison Pearson. But the co-pilot's taking a break. So I'm delighted to welcome back a friend of the podcast who's co-presented alongside me in the past. It's Nick Timothy, former Downing Street Chief of Staff and now Tory MP for West Suffolk. Nick, great to have you back with us.
Hi, Liam. It's great to be on.
Now we're coming to the end of July and what should be the more relaxed, even lazy dog days of summer. School's out, university graduations are mostly over, and the House of Commons has risen. Nick's joining us from his lovely Suffolk constituency, and rightly so. But far from slowing down, life here in the UK, at least as measured by the news cycle, seems to be speeding up. Both Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner and her nominal boss, Keir Starmer, Big Angies, it would appear, increasingly wearing the proverbial trousers, but both of them have said this Labour government must now address concerns over immigration, without specifying how. They're talking about such a tricky issue because away from Downing Street, of course, the mood is febrile. Protests outside asylum hotels by locals furious at the sudden imposition of large numbers of young men in their towns have led to clashes with the police. The observation from one MP that the country is, quote, a tinderbox seems close to the mark. Yet beyond a vague sense that something isn't right, the people smugglers are still doing a roaring trade across the channel, and there are few signs from government as to what they intend to do. Meanwhile, the UK continues to edge, there is no other way to say this, towards a really quite serious fiscal and financial crisis. On Tuesday, we learned the government borrowed another £20.7 billion during June alone, the highest June borrowing total since the COVID pandemic, and £6.6 billion more than the same month last year. What's more, some £16.4 billion of that £20.7 billion of extra borrowing, over 80%, went on debt service payments on our existing and fast-growing pile of national debt. The UK's public finances now resemble a Ponzi scheme, as we've often said. It's like using a credit card to pay merely the interest bill on all your other credit cards, not paying off the debt itself. Good job the government isn't spending billions of pounds each year housing endless illegal immigrants in hotels. Oh, maybe that's why the UK state's spending almost twice on debt service payments as it spends on defence, more than it spends on schools. Financial markets are now charging the UK government more to borrow than they charge not just France, Greece and the US. Our borrowing costs now outstrip those in Italy, Spain and Greece too. When, oh when, are the bulk of our political and media class going to acknowledge there really is a problem? But before we start, Nick, you're a proud Birmingham boy, the son of a steelworker and school secretary. And another Brummie boy made good is John Michael Osborne, better known of course as Ozzy, lead singer of the iconic band Black Sabbath. Ozzy Osbourne died on Tuesday. Were you a fan?
Yeah, I was a bit, and he actually grew up just down the road from where I went to school in Aston in Birmingham by the Villa ground. But actually one of the connections for me is that at Villa Park they play quite a lot of Black Sabbath. They play Crazy Train and I think Paranoid sometimes. And actually, I think he played his final gig on the 5th of July, I think it was, at Villa Park. So it's a bit sad.
And you're, of course, a massive Villa fan, as a lot of people at Westminster know. A lot of listeners will think, oh, that's heavy metal. It's all a bit brash. It's all a bit loud and egotistical and nonsensical. I'm not a massive heavy metal fan, but I think differently. I think in the 70s, when you had the likes of Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple and Black Sabbath, the big three, I think, with Black Sabbath really at the fore of the whole genre, they came up with some amazing songs. It wasn't just all about thrash and turning up the volume. My favourite Black Sabbath song, and it's an unusual one, but I do recommend it to Planet Normal listeners, It's called Hard Road. It's on a not very well-known Black Sabbath album, often panned by the critics, called Never Say Die, a more obscure track, but some fantastic lyrics and some brilliant melodies. So there we go, Black Sabbath. Segueing, Nick, to Epping, to immigration. Are we in for a long, hot summer of trouble?
Well, the government seems to think so, don't they? I mean, they've been briefing the papers, and you said in the intro that Angela Rayner is starting to say, oh, well, maybe there are concerns about migration that might be driving some of the disquiet and potential disorder. And actually, it was her department last year that said in an internal paper that anger about the asylum hotels was linked to the riots of last summer.
Yeah.
But they kept it all a secret. They won't publish the paper. They won't answer elementary questions about what it said and so on, which I think is part of the problem. And even now, I think they were briefing the Times today that actually really public concerns driven by social media and school absence and things like this. But we all know that the public are really angry about what's going on with the asylum system, and rightly so.
I've always thought of you, Nick, as somebody who, while you're a Conservative, of course, you worked at the highest level in Theresa May's government. You know, you are a proud Burmese. You do have lots of contacts across the Midlands and the North. You do talk to MPs from across the political spectrum. This is a problem for Labour, isn't it? Because so many of their traditional red wall voters in the Midlands and the North, they tend to be the towns where a lot of the asylum seekers have been housed in hotels. Though, of course, Essex is very much in the south of England. Epping is a suburb pretty much of London. It's on the London Underground, of course, though, on that big extension that heads east on the Central Line. But how much of a problem is this now for Labour, before we come on to what your party may want to do about it?
Well, it's a huge problem. I mean, they don't have a policy to deal with the channel crossings. They got rid of the Rwanda scheme. They scrapped the duty to remove element of the Illegal Migration Act. And they hoped, I think, that they would deal with the problem by speeding up asylum decisions and then basically just hiding the migrants in the welfare budget, which is not published in such a granular way that you'd be able to see how much these people were costing. But of course, actually, if you speed up the decisions and you say yes to more people, it means even more people want to come. And sure enough, that's what's happened. I think the number of channel crossings is up by 50% since the election. So it's a big problem, and it's playing out right across the country. So I'm the MP for West Suffolk. We have migrants housed here. Again, there's loads of secrecy. People aren't told when migrants are about to move into their area. There's lots of concern about public safety because lots of these migrants are the kinds of nationalities where, if you look at the published data, the crime rates, and especially for quite serious crimes like sexual crimes, the crime rates are very high. So people are very worried, and the government's not handling it well at all. And we're talking about Epping, but there were protests in Dis, which is not very far away from here at all.
A beautiful, sleepy, with all respect to my friends in Dis, sort of retirement town, isn't it? It's a very sort of low-key, attractive, quiet place. The last place you'd expect to have protests on the street.
Yeah, if you'd said that there were public protests on the streets of Dis about the sort of forced relocation of asylum seekers into the town 20 years ago, we'd have probably all said that was crazy, some kind of dystopian future.
Do you think some kind of Rwanda scheme is going to come back? Do you think third country processing is going to be a mainstream political idea? Are Labour going to grasp the nettle, admit they were wrong, some face-saving thing that won't be Rwanda, it will be somewhere else? Because it's not as if the French are going to allow us to build a big processing place in Calais, is it? Do you think that will come back, a form of the Rwanda scheme or something similar?
Broadly speaking, there's two different ways of doing this, and they sound the same. And I think there's a possibility Labour will consider one but not the other. So Rwanda was not really offshore processing. The Rwanda policy meant that if an illegal immigrant arrived in Britain, they would basically be given the choice. You either go back to your own country or you go to Rwanda and have your asylum claim processed there. And if you're granted asylum, you stay in Rwanda and you live there. You never come to Britain. And then there's another way of doing it, which is to say people will be removed from Britain and processed in a third country And if their asylum claim is accepted, then they can come to Britain. And Labour have flirted with this kind of second idea a little bit. There was talk of having a deal like that with Albania. It didn't come to pass. But really, I think the most important thing is to try to learn from the countries that have actually made this kind of thing work. And Australia killed their problem years ago by saying that if you enter Australia illegally, you will never, ever be allowed to stay. If you want to claim asylum, you can go to this tiny Pacific state called Nauru, and that's where you will live for good. And as a result, the numbers just fell down to zero pretty much straight away. And I don't think Labour will be prepared to do that. They attacked Rwanda so aggressively, I don't think they'll be prepared to consider it.
My sense is that the Australian electorate's a bit more steely-eyed than the UK electorate. But do you think that's changing? Do you think the UK electorate is now ready? Do you think the Overton window has shifted enough? Do you think, polite Middle England, for want of a better phrase, the kind of median UK voter would go with the idea of a kind of Australian style, no mercy, if you like, system?
Well, I would challenge the premise of your question. So I don't think public opinion has actually changed a great deal. The British public have been pretty angry with immigration for a really long time.
Or maybe the political class is catching up.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the difference.
Okay.
I think the politicians and the media have started to notice, and the numbers have got so high, incorporating legal as well as illegal immigration. And the reality of illegal immigration and the dispersal of people claiming asylum to places like Epping and Diss and wherever mean that it's become more prominent. And finally, the media and the politicians have started to pay attention. But I think the public have been up for very robust policies for a really long time. It's just they've been ignored.
I think they have been. And you can see that in the privacy of polling booths, since the 2014 European election, which of course UKIP won, the first time either Labour or the Tories hadn't won a national election since 1906. Since then, so many electoral events where the public, in the privacy of the polling booth, has backed the party that's been most robust about tackling, too much immigration. I totally accept your point, but I think what's happened is that because now politicians are talking about it a lot more, because they're being forced to by events on the ground, the media are now talking about it more. It's almost become socially acceptable to talk about it openly rather than in the privacy of your own home or in the pub or at dinner parties and so on. I think the kind of Overton window has shifted in a narrative sense to the extent that you've even got, Labour MPs who I know telling me that they want to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, a subject that we'll come to later in this podcast.
Yeah, I think that's right. And let's come back to the ECHR. I think on immigration itself, the debate is obviously to some degree about how we massively reduce the numbers of people coming here in a really radical way. But the interesting thing as well is because the numbers have been so high over the last, certainly since Brexit and the so-called Boris wave, the numbers have been so high in that period. We have to remember that most of the people who have come in that period have come on time-limited visas. And the expectation should be that those people leave at the end of their visa. And actually, if policy was sensible, if they break the law or if they're not contributing or if they're claiming benefits, we should tell them to leave anyway. So actually, the debate is not just about how we reduce the inflow in the future, but it's also got to be about who we say, actually, you have to leave, and a willingness to enforce any decisions about telling people to leave. And that is a way in which I think the debate has started to change. Not very many people are talking like that. I mean, I've given a couple of speeches in Parliament to that effect. But I think if I'd said that kind of thing 10 years ago, I'd have been cancelled. Whereas now it's seen as okay to discuss.
Potentially, but not if you'd said it 20 years ago, interestingly enough. The likes of when David Blunkett was Home Secretary under Labour, he deported plenty of people. It's almost as if during the 2010s, something happened that we weren't allowed to talk about this stuff anymore. And the UK forgot that it was actually able to remove people from the country when it wanted to. Maybe, again, that was because the ECHR was coming more and more to the fore and the lawyers were becoming more activist and the Strasbourg judges were becoming more activist. How is your party, Nick, going to really define itself on this issue? Of course, so much of what Reform says is about this issue. Some people would even say Reform, slightly unfairly, I think, but it's a reasonable characterization in some senses, is a kind of one issue party. They certainly came to the fore on this one issue. How's your party going to respond in a way that means you don't get left behind in terms of the national debate, and that you can remain not just politically relevant, but a contender to become the next government?
Well, we have a big problem, which is we let the country down. So after Brexit, we had the opportunity to really reduce and control immigration in a tough and sensible way. And the party in government introduced a points-based system, which was effectively the most liberal immigration system in the developed world. And the numbers went shooting up. And we also failed to deal with the channel crossings. So we have a credibility problem, and you can't overcome a credibility problem unless you're completely honest about that record. So we have to be brutal with ourselves. We have to be painfully honest about why those things happened. It wasn't a mistake or a failure to deliver on legal immigration. It was a conscious decision, and that was wrong, and the country are furious about it, and I share that anger. So we have to show that we are quite sincere when we say that that can never, ever happen again. And to some degree, as far as we can, we have to put right those mistakes by, as I say, saying to people who came on time-limited visas, you actually do have to leave. There shouldn't be this really easy route to settlement and citizenship, because we can't have these huge numbers being permanent. And then I think we've got to be really specific and serious and clear about what it will take to get the numbers down and to get people out of the country again. And because I think too often in the past, and the last Conservative government was guilty of this, too often in the past, people have said that they will the ends and they haven't willed the means. And on the channel crossings, the refusal to contemplate leaving the European Convention on Human Rights was a big part of that, because Rwanda was actually never going to work as long as the courts were able to say it's not generally safe, or it's not safe in these specific circumstances.
Again, we'll come on to the ECHR, but just briefly before we move on, Nick, because I want to hear your thoughts on Labour's Islamophobia inquiry. You've been talking about that a lot in the Commons. I want to get your thoughts also on the really horrendous borrowing numbers that came out this week. But just before we move on, how did that happen under the Tories? Of course, a lot of the media attention focuses on the boats, on the illegal migrants, on the subsequent hotel stays and so on. But those numbers are tens of thousands, albeit very incendiary tens of thousands, if you like. The legal migration on visas, as you say, is hundreds of thousands each year. We went from 323,000 net just before the Brexit vote in 2015. It's almost 1 million net migration in recent years, legal migration. How did that happen? Was it business interest pushing for those visas? Was it the deep state, the blob, not letting ministers do what they want? Was it Boris being too liberal? What happened?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, because the numbers have been so high, we shouldn't normalize the numbers that you just used as a baseline, right? Those numbers are ridiculously high as well.
The 3,000 number before in 2015.
Yeah. Levels of immigration
absolutely
are completely unacceptable. But you see this now, right? Where some people who are part of the kind of pro-immigration left or in the government, they sort of say, well, we'll be able to get immigration down. And by that, they might mean net migration of 500,000. But these numbers are still absolutely crazy. So I think that's really important. I think, look, it's not good enough to say, the blob didn't do what people wanted, or they were let down by the system or whatever. This was a clear policy choice. I was writing in the Telegraph at the time, if you look at this points-based system that's being designed, the numbers are going to go through the roof. And they went up even higher than even I'd anticipated. But it was obvious that the system that was being designed was going to increase the numbers enormously. And that was a deliberate policy choice.
By who and why?
It was Boris's government, right? So in the end, Boris has to take responsibility for that. I think that some of it was about a kind of ideological openness to the world. I mean, he's a liberal. Some of it was about a receptiveness to the special pleading of different interests. So universities were lobbying very hard for students to be able to stay and work automatically at the end of their courses for a particular length of time. That was just straightforwardly given away. The student visa route is a big part of the migration story of recent years. And it's always sold as, well, this isn't really emigration, is it? It's just people coming to study and then leave again. But it's not, because actually a big part of the offer for the universities is the ability to stay and live and work here at the end of your studies.
And all your dependents.
And if you try to take it away, they cry blue murder. And that in itself is the proof that they're selling long-term immigration, not just education.
Tell me a bit more about the work you've been doing on Labour's Islamophobia inquiry. Why have you been speaking out about it so much, Nick?
Well, I'm really worried about this because I think we have a real crisis of free speech in Britain, and especially free speech as it applies to our ability to talk about Islam and things done by Muslims. So in this year so far, we've had 2 people prosecuted for desecrating Qurans in public using the Public Order Act. And the way that that's worked is the police, prosecutors, and the courts have said the actions of the person protesting risk a violent reaction from other people who can't deal with criticism of their beliefs. And therefore, the protester is guilty of a Public Order Act offence. I think that's completely twisted. It's not what the Public Order Act was written to do. And it's victim blaming, in effect. In fact, in one of the cases, the judge actually said that the fact that the man who had burned the Quran and criticised Islam had been attacked by 2 others was proof that his behaviour was disorderly. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. So we have that. Now, we also have this definition that the government is working to produce of Islamophobia, which I think is a nonsense concept. And it's a deliberate invention by campaigners to try to protect Islam itself from criticism and scrutiny, and the behavior of some Muslims and certain extremist organizations who want to go about their business without people asking pesky questions. So the definition of Islamophobia that was produced by a group of MPs in 2018 explicitly said that it's Islamophobic to talk about the rape gangs and the ethnicity and the religion of the rape gangs. It says it's Islamophobic to question the concept of Islamophobia.
Which is Kafkaesque, really.
Isn't it? I know, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
It says it's Islamophobic to oppose the self-determination of Muslims in Kashmir.
And how much pushback are you getting on this, Nick, from Labour MPs in the House when you speak about it? And indeed from the 5 independent Muslim MPs who now form a caucus in the House?
Well, in one of my speeches about this in the House, one of the independent MPs stood up and said, well, what would you say to the family of Mohammed Salim, who was an elderly Muslim who was murdered, I think, 10 or 11, 12 years ago? To which the answer is obviously that was a terrible crime and it was a murder and it's already illegal. But what these people are trying to do is they're trying to elide the protection of people from physical harm and discrimination with the protection of ideas from scrutiny and criticism. And that's completely wrong. So the process that the government set up, they set up a working group. It's chaired by Dominic Grieve, who had previously endorsed the 2018 definition that is so problematic.
Of course, a former Tory MP who lost the whip during the Brexit wars.
He did, yes. It has 4 other members, all of whom are Muslim. And this working group did a call for evidence, but it did it sort of secretly. It sent the consultation document to hand-picked organisations, didn't announce it was doing it, kept it a really short period, because they were hoping, I think, to just get answers from the usual suspects. And I've been trying to make as much noise about it as possible and produced a template response that people concerned about this could use. And I think we've managed to get, actually above 1,000 or in the thousands of people to respond. But the government has said that the report produced by the working group will be private. They won't publish it. They won't give us information about who was invited to take part. I asked Angela Rayner in the House whether she could guarantee that no Muslim Brotherhood affiliates were taking part. She couldn't. I've asked written questions saying, well, the government says that it won't deal with the Muslim Council of Britain because of concerns about its connections to extremism in the past. Would they take part? And they said everyone's free to take part. So the whole thing is absolutely crazy.
But this kind of religious exceptionalism, which some Muslims want, obviously, there are many, many Muslims in the UK who are far more moderate than this. But this kind of push for religious exceptionalism, Nick, that you've been describing, it's going to make a lot of headway during this parliament, isn't it? Because this Labour government knows it has a problem in many of its constituencies with just the size, the growing scale of the Muslim vote, given demographic factors.
Yeah, so it became well known, didn't it, that 5 independent MPs beat Labour candidates at the election in places where Labour would have expected to win. They were campaigning on Gaza. But there are lots of seats where Labour just about held on. So Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, Jess Phillips, who's a Home Office Minister, Wes Streeting, Health Secretary, they all only just held on.
Rayner's majority is like less than 7,000.
Yeah.
It's not huge when you've got a massive, 170-odd seat majority.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a memo written by Morgan McSweeney, the PM's main advisor, which was leaked to The Spectator and published quite recently, where he said to Keir Starmer, there are groups of voters, including younger voters and Muslims, who voted for other parties, and we need a strategy to win them back. And a few months later, they're trying to define Islamophobia, which is going to stifle free speech, basically create some kind of blasphemy law for Islam. They're not doing anything to correct the courts in their application of the Public Order Act. You can see what's going on.
Today's Planet Normal guest is Lord Peter Lilley. Peter Lilley entered Parliament in 1983 as Tory MP for St Albans, later Hitchin and Harpenden, and served in the cabinets of both Margaret Thatcher and John Major. Educated at Cambridge, where he studied natural science before switching to economics, Peter Lilley served as Economic and then Financial Secretary to the Treasury, then Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, and finally, during the mid to late 90s, Social Security Secretary. In opposition, he was Shadow Chancellor and Deputy Tory Leader, later backing Brexit before becoming a life peer in 2018. Lord Lilley remains a highly influential voice at Westminster and beyond, and earlier this month wrote a paper for the Centre for Policy Studies, Britain and the ECHR, Past Myths, Present Problems and Future Options. I started by asking Peter Lilley why he thinks the UK should now leave the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights.
Well, I began by looking into the history of it, because every speech in the House of Lords by a human rights lawyer and many others begins by saying it was all a British invention, it just incorporates British rights, it was eagerly adopted by Attlee and Churchill, and we should all love it. And I looked into the history, and it turns out to be complete bunkum. Attlee was extremely reluctant to sign up to the European Convention of Human Rights, and only did so on condition that the jurisdiction of the court it created didn't apply in the UK, and that we didn't have to change any laws to conform with rulings from the European Court. And that position, a couple of months later, was adopted by Churchill and all subsequent Conservative prime ministers. It was only changed by Harold Wilson 15 years later. So it's a complete myth. And I thought, well, if people are relying on a myth to try and get us to believe in it, let's look and see what happened. And the interesting thing was it did cause us a lot of the problems that Attlee and Churchill foresaw, such that even Blair, who made the individual rights of the convention part of British law, So British courts could...
In his Human Rights Act,
In his Human Rights Act,
Yeah.
yes, in 1998, came into force in 2000. Even he subsequently considered leaving it in part or overriding it by British law, as did Sunak and May and Cameron. So it's affected and been found problematic to leaders of both parties in practice. And why is this? It's because it effectively transfers the power to make laws and make political judgments from Parliament to the courts. They're asked to interpret very vague statements like right to life. What does that mean? We're just debating whether or not a state can participate in killing people. Well, a strict reading of the European Convention of Human Rights would say, no, it can't. Parliament will probably decide it can, but it could be overridden by the European Court. Conversely, Parliament may throw it out, and the European Court might invent a new right, the right to die, and that would overrule us. And it's unaccountable to the public, to Parliament, and it can't be overridden by us.
But this idea that it did emerge from the ashes of the Second World War when Britain bestrode the world and Clem Attlee, the high priest of the modern Labour Party, as it were, and Churchill, everybody was united. This was a great British export to the world. How could we possibly even countenance leaving this thing? It's become like a third rail of British politics, isn't it? You're not even allowed to think about it, or you're some kind of swivel-eyed loon.
Well, that's true, and a lot of people would like to stop us thinking about it, and that's why I've been thinking about it, and so have a number of other people. Swella's produced an excellent document just now.
Ex-Home Secretary.
Yeah, and ex-Attorney General.
Indeed.
So she's
proper lawyer.
a lot of...
KC, as it were, yeah.
And a little while ago, the Policy Exchange produced a pamphlet forwarded by Jonathan Sumption, one of our great legal minds, and Andrew Roberts, one of the great historians, going also back into the history and showing that the history is bunkum.
And your new papers for the Centre for Policy Studies, we should say. So a lot of output now saying we should leave this thing. Do you think it will happen? Kemi Badenoch, who obviously leads the Conservative Party, your party, seems to be itching towards that idea. For reform, it's, of course, we're going to leave this thing. The Labour Party seems quite reluctant, though even some Labour figures are now saying sotto voce, under their breath, that maybe we should leave, not least because of the impact, the perceived impact of our membership of the ECHR on immigration, on our inability to deport people over many years, even people who are proven terrorists, proven enemies of the state.
Yeah, well, as I say, Blair himself asked John Reid, his Home Secretary, and I think Blunkett, another Home Secretary, to look into ways of overriding it or leaving bits of it. So the Labour Party has found it as problematic as the Conservatives have when they've been in power. We might even find Starmer being overruled on the question of VAT on schools, because Lord Panic, one of our great lawyers, has said that's contrary to the European Convention of Human Rights. Well, that's not clearly what Starmer would like to see, but if it did happen, he'd be hoisted by his own petard. No, we've got to look at it seriously. I think the greatest risk is not the problems we face in any specific policy area, though they amount to an awful lot, but the fact that it ultimately politicizes the judiciary. Because we're making the judges take political decisions, which should be taken by Parliament, and then they're not accountable to Parliament or the electorate. People are beginning to criticise the judges and say, oh, this is all because of the judges. Well, it's because we told the judges to make laws instead of making them in Parliament where they should be. And
ultimately, not even UK judges, but judges in a foreign court.
Yes, both UK
After
and
we've
foreign.
left the European Union, at a time when, of course, I think, maybe you agree or disagree, that Overton window of politics is shifting in quite a significant way. I think the British public, incredibly tolerant in its essence, incredibly warm towards the idea of immigration over numbers of years, is now shifting because of the pace and the scope of immigration. And yet the ECHR is still seen as some kind of obstacle against politicians really getting a handle on this problem.
It is, and it's a necessary but not sufficient condition if we're to get control of immigration that we leave in whole or in part the ECHR. But there are other things we'll have to do as well. And I think actually Kem is right that she's asked David Wilson, who's a very, very good lawyer in the House of Lords, to look not just at the ECHR, but the whole issue of how different legal agreements are causing a conflict between the courts and government and how that can be resolved. She's called it an inquiry into lawfare. I think that's the right way to
politicisation of the law for specific political ends, be it removing Donald Trump or inquiries against your political enemies and so on.
Yeah, well, if we continue down the road of leaving judges to take political decisions, then people will want the judges to be chosen politically, as they are in the States. And you end up with a Supreme Court in the States which is chosen on the basis of the political allegiance of the judges and their life expectancy, so that a president can affect law for decades to come if he can choose a young judge who's going to last forever.
And there's something about that, Peter Lilley, which strikes me as much as I love the United States, as fundamentally undemocratic, even anti-democratic.
It is, and it's certainly very anti-Britain's idea of democracy, which is ultimately that Parliament's there to take political decisions. If we don't like it, we turf the bastards, the blighters out. I've been declared a bastard myself, I think.
I think you're allowed to say that.
I turf the
by
blighters
one John Major, I think, at the time.
Something like that.
Courtesy of my old friend Michael Brunson, the ITN political editor. If you're listening, Michael, very nice to remember you and your work.
It's not forgotten.
It is not forgotten. And yet, Peter Lilley, even within the Conservative Party, as we're recording Planet Normal interview here at the Telegraph, Kemi Badenoch's in the middle of a reshuffle. James Cleverly, former Home Secretary, of course, former Foreign Secretary, is being brought back into the cabinet, having his arm twisted, I think some people are saying, because the party leader is so keen on some kind of unity. We can come on to that. But in recent weeks, Kemi Badenoch has been inching towards this position. We may now need to leave these ECHR. She wants to be very much an evidence-driven Conservative leader as she comes up with policy. And almost immediately, James Cleverly knocked that down. Said, if we left the ECHR, it wouldn't do us any good in terms of getting control of immigration. Why is he doing that?
Well, I don't know. But he has previously said that he would be prepared to consider leaving. His preference would be reform. Well, I start from the position, what's the least we have to do? Because I'm an old-star Conservative. I don't like changing anything.
You do, and that is clear in your paper.
And I look at what the least is, and unfortunately, nothing will resolve the underlying problem of the politicisation of the judiciary except leaving. We could restrict the scope. Attempts at reform have taken decades before and achieved almost nothing.
And you need all the other signatories to agree, which is the European Union plus others.
And even if there were some satisfactory degree of limiting the scope of the ECHR that we could try to get the others to agree to, we'd only get any discussion of it if we threaten to leave or say we will leave unless and until you change it in this way. So you've got to be prepared to leave, even to get reform. You can't say, well, we'll try for reform and then we'll think about leaving. You won't get any reform unless you're prepared to leave, and even then you probably won't get it. You'll have to remain left.
You'll remember when the Tories lost the last general election big time in 1997, and there ensued, you were still in the House, of course.
There is deputy leader of the party.
Indeed, shadow chancellor for a while, I seem to remember. There ensued sort of Tory psychodrama about Europe, a huge split, which may well have been necessary for the country to go through. We can debate that. Is there going to be a big Tory psychodrama about ECHR? Does it stir as strong emotions, or do you think the case for leaving is more mainstream within the Conservative Party than the case for leaving the European Union was at that stage? Because it wasn't mainstream then, was it?
Yep, I think there's a shift of opinion towards leaving the ECHR. And even before that shift began, people like Theresa May voted against leaving the European Union, but said we should leave the ECHR. She thought that was a sort of alternative.
As a long-suffering Home Secretary, very long-serving Home Secretary, she'd come up against ECHR rulings. Abu Qatanza she couldn't deport, of course, and that really, really frustrated her.
And as I say, even James Cleverly may have said some slightly unhelpful things recently, but he has said that he would consider it. Well, if he's prepared to consider it, I think most of the party will. There's a few, of course, people who are lawyers, and they've come to convince themselves that we ought to be ruled by lawyers, not by law. And I hope they'll think again about that and think we're actually a parliamentary democracy, not a legocracy, not a judgeocracy.
To what extent do you think the 120 or so Tory MPs in the Commons at the moment, a much diminished party, of course, to what extent do you think the majority of your MPs are actually Conservatives. There are people in some parts of the Tory party who have talked in the aftermath of the 2024 wipeout as survival of the wettists. It was only the more kind of left-wing, Lib Dem-leaning Tory MPs who survived for the most part. Do you think there's something in that?
No, I don't think that. I remember back to Mrs. Thatcher's period as, first of all, when she had effectively Kemi's job, she was leader of the opposition, and she had a shadow cabinet which was dominated by the Wets, remained dominant faction even when she became prime minister, and were confident that they'd get rid of her by the end of her first term, which they didn't. So there always has been a spectrum of opinion between people who actually think what needs to be done and people who think, oh, what would go down well in a dinner party with our posh friends. And ultimately, the people who choose their policies by what goes down well in dinner parties with their posh friends go along with a strong leader who's got good evidence and a feeling in the country that something needs to be done. And they did under Mrs. Thatcher. They didn't like what she was doing. They thought that somehow she'd have to give up and it wouldn't work and they could get rid of her. But eventually, after a couple of terms, they pretended they'd always agreed all along.
I'm old enough to remember the mid to late 1970s, the chaos, the winter of discontent, the yearning across the country for something to change, who runs Britain and so on. Aren't we in a similar position now? Aren't we in a position where, the sort of posh wet Tories who are worried about their friends at dinner parties will follow a strong leader? In that sense, isn't it the case that Kemi Badenoch should be focusing a lot less on mollifying the left of her own party in Parliament and a lot more on saying things that resonate with the public and push her ahead from where she currently is in the opinion polls?
Well, actually, I hope she does neither of those things. I hope she does what Mrs. Thatcher was persuaded to do by John Hoskins and Norman Strauss, the people who wrote the Stepping Stones document.
Seminal political document.
They said, don't choose your policies because they go down well in focus groups and opinion polls. Don't choose your policies because they're what your predecessors did, Ted Heath and all the Wets. Decide what the country is going to need if and when you become Prime Minister. Then what mandate you'll need at the next election. Then how you're going to win that mandate. How you're going to persuade people that that's the right set of policies. Because the electorate's very intelligent. If you say, look, we're heading for bankruptcy, you've got to do this, this and this, those individual policies may not be popular. The sort of policy spectrum that Mrs. Thatcher was associated with weren't individually popular. But people could see that she believed in it. She wasn't putting it forward because some focus group told her to, but because it was necessary for the country. And they said, well, someone's got to do what's necessary for the country. She seems to know. She's got conviction. She's thought about it deeply. Let's do it. And I think Kemi's going, slightly different personality and so on, in that direction.
Does she remind you of Margaret Thatcher?
She does in some ways, yeah. And I've known her since 2006.
And you also knew you were in Margaret Thatcher's policy unit, famously. She used to grill you when you came up with the policies, give you a proper roasting in order to stress test them.
Absolutely. Well, that was her.
I can see the fear in your eyes now.
Well, that was how she tested whether a policy was a good one.
What reminds you of Margaret Thatcher when you see, talk to, interact with Kemi Badenoch?
Well, I'll tell you. I got to know her when I had to chair the policy group on aid, trade and development. I went out to West Africa and Kemi was I put her on the commission because she turned out to be so good. She met up with me out there and we were looking at aid programs. And we saw a group of government officials saying they were spending a lot of taxpayers' money on helping the illiterate market mummers, who are actually the main business people in the Nigerian markets, to write business plans. And we all listened to this very attentively. And Kemi just leant forward and said, you say they're illiterate. How can they write business plans?
Yeah, just pure common sense.
Yes, these officials hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
So
not particularly polite.
I thought,
shattering some illusions.
This is a young woman I think will go far. And she is going far.
Will your party give her time? Will the parliamentary party give her time?
I hope so.
Robert Jenrick is on manoeuvres, as you know.
Well, I think Jenrick's a good bloke. And he should be her Norman Tebbit. Norman Tebbit was a tough hitter, went out and attacked the other side vigorously and a whole range of things. And if Jenrick does that, that's fine and that's good. If he's manoeuvring to try and displace her, or lets it be thought that that is the case, that's not good for him and it's not good for her and it's not good for the party and therefore it's not good for the country.
How long has she got?
Well, I hope she's got until the next election. Sadly, that's too long. I mean, that's 4 years. I would like that to be brought forward because all the time things are getting worse. The government is actually aggravating our problems. I thought that they would realise those problems were so severe that they'd have to start doing the sort of things that Jim Callaghan had to do when the IMF came in.
Yeah.
Jim Callaghan was the only Prime Minister ever to cut the budget of the NHS because the IMF told him to.
This is 1976. We were literally bailed out, cap in hand.
And we said, you can have that money if you do this, this and this.
Is there a danger of that now?
Yeah. By the end of this Parliament, there's a distinct danger.
You think we could face a 1976 moment?
Yeah, I fear so. And I wish they feared so, and then they'd start doing the right thing. And, of course, if they do enough of the right thing, they might get re-elected. But I don't mind if they get re-elected if they're doing the right things. And more likely, they'd pave the way for a return for a government which would do more of the right things more credibly.
Of your many cabinet roles, Peter Lilley, I think your stint as Social Security Secretary was, if I may say so, the one that you're most remembered for. You put forward some pretty tough policies. I think I'm right in saying, aren't I? You're the only post-war Social Security Secretary, Welfare Secretary, as we'd now say, who actually managed to get Social Security spending under control by any definition. Just explain how you did that and also your thoughts when you were looking at Labour's inability to stop spending in the current Parliament on health and disability benefits, increasing from 70 odd billion to 95 billion rather than 100 billion. They couldn't even save that 5 billion in the increase, the massive increase over the lifetime of this Parliament.
Well, funny enough, I had a very similar problem. When I took over, I looked at what had happened, and the Social Security, the welfare budget had increased twice as rapidly as the national income throughout the period since the welfare state was created.
We're talking about the early 90s when you took over.
Yeah. And the biggest rise currently at the point I took over was in invalidity benefit, which had the number of people on it had trebled over the previous decade, even though the country was not getting unhealthier. When I looked into it, it was because people could get onto this benefit with a note from their GP, which their GPs almost automatically gave them. So I replaced it, and I thought it would be hugely unpopular and controversial, by the requirement to pass an objective medical test carried out by doctors employed by the department. Actually, it turned out to be very popular because most people knew that this thing was being abused.
And now we've gone back to GP gateway, if you like, and online, on the phone.
Absolutely. And with people giving advice on how you can answer the questions to get on it. But having decided to do something and introduce this objective test, I said, well, it's much easier to stop people getting benefit, which they don't really need, than to take it away from people who've got onto it, who've got demoralised and so on. So I didn't actually take it away from the existing claimants. And that was the mistake that the government has made, tried to take it away, just reduce the benefits of everybody on it, rather than say, actually, from this point on, you're only going to get it if you were genuinely disabled, genuinely incapable of work. And actually, the other thing I discovered was not only was it popular with people who lived next door to someone who was on the benefit but training for the Olympic team, and there were people like that, but the people who were on the benefit or applying for the benefit but instead told, sorry, you've got to get a job, would actually thank me for getting them a job. It wasn't me that got them a job. They got themselves a job. And when they got a job, they were better off and they felt self-respect. And they were revitalised. The longer you remain on benefit, the more demoralising it is, but that makes it more difficult to get off. So we want to stop people getting on in the first place if they're don't really need it and aren't really entitled to it.
And just briefly, how much fraud is there in our benefit system, in your view?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I discovered there wasn't even someone individual in the department responsible for fraud. So I put someone responsible, and we did publish an analysis of how much fraud. They muddle up fraud and sort of mistakenly given benefit, because it's hard very often to tell the difference. And it wasn't a huge proportion, but once you start cracking down on it, you stop new people coming on who would actually be much better off in their life if they weren't there. And there was it was in the billions of pounds.
Lord Lilley, thanks a lot for appearing on Planet Normal.
Great pleasure.
So there you go, Nick. Peter Lilley, he's just written his paper, ECHR, Past Myths, Present Problems, Future Options. Readers can get that from the Centre of Policy Studies. It's online. What do you think? It's an increasingly active debate, isn't it?
Oh, I think he's totally right. I mean, I'm a big Peter Lilley fan, and I think he's always worth listening to anyway. But on this issue, I've been convinced of the need to leave for many years. And he's right. There's a lot of stuff and nonsense said about it. The history is completely misrepresented. I'm glad he corrected the record in that respect. And I think if you ask people who say that we shouldn't leave, what is the actual reason of substance why it's in our national interest to stay, they can't really come up with anything. They tend to they talk about our place in the world and start comparing us to Russia and stupid things like that. But there isn't really, I think, a clear-cut national interest reason to stay in it. So they sometimes mumble about how it's against the trade deal that we struck after Brexit, but actually it's not. It's not even mentioned in the trade deal. It's in the security cooperation agreement with the Europeans. But even then it says if either side chooses to leave the ECHR, the other side has the right to review the agreement. The sky is not going to fall in if we leave this thing.
Now, Suella Braverman, of course, former Home Secretary, she just this week released a film on why the UK should leave the ECHR. She's more belt and braces than Peter Lilley. She wants to rewrite parts of the Good Friday Agreement, the Welsh Devolution Act, Scottish Devolution Act, and so on. She is, of course, a trained barrister, former QC, KC. So I'm sure a lot of people in your party and beyond will be looking at what she has to say. But do you think, for instance, Kemi Badenoch, who's talked about this, somewhat elliptically, has got the stomach to do this? Because a lot of your parliamentary colleagues don't want to do it, do they? They still sign up to the fact that, Britain bestrode the world, ashes of the Second World War, and this would be outrageous for us to leave. We wouldn't be a civilized nation anymore. For instance, we just had this Tory reshuffle, which, we should talk about. James Cleverly comes back, big beast, former Foreign Secretary, former Home Secretary. In his first interview, he basically disagrees with Kemi and says we shouldn't leave the ECHR.
Well, look, James is a good guy, and he's obviously come in knowing that he is bound by collective responsibility, and Kemi has set up the review on our policy with regards to the ECHR, and that's led
by David Wolfson, of course.
Lord Wolfson, who's a very, very good man.
Indeed.
I mean, it feels to me like the centre of gravity in the party has shifted quite considerably. I mean, I first started talking about the ECHR behind closed doors when I was in the Home Office more than 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Started writing about it in my own name about 10 years ago. And I think people thought it was a fairly exotic opinion then. And it's become quite a mainstream thing because...
like supporting Aston Villa.
On the contrary, we are very good these days. There have been years when that would have been a fair comment. I think the crisis in border security and in the immigration system has just really brought it home to people. And I just do not believe you can have a functioning immigration system while you are bound by the ECHR. You can't.
So on to the reshuffle. I got to ask you about it. Some people thought you may be involved in the reshuffle. Nick, maybe you can comment on that. But why do you think Kemi's done it now? Do you think it will make a difference? Do you think it will help her to start to really figure in the opinion polls in a way that settles the quite febrile speculation that's still around about her leadership? The New Statesman, obviously, no great friends of the Tories, but their current cover story is, in a throwback to that old Maurice Sarchi Tory campaigning poster, Labour isn't working, very effective poster. Their headline this week is Kemi isn't working.
I haven't seen the New Statesman story, but reshuffles take place fairly routinely in politics. You appoint a team, you see, where the round pegs go in round holes, and you update your team accordingly as you go. I mean, it's a well-trodden path. For example, I think promoting Neil O'Brien into this policy role was excellent. He's got a massive brain. He's a data nerd, brilliant policy wonk. He's exactly what the party needs if we are to come up with the right kind of policy prospectus for the future. So I think it's good. These things need to happen on a reasonably frequent basis. Reshuffles rarely change the weather one way or the other. It's just about keeping your team fresh and making sure people are in the right jobs.
I agree that Neil O'Brien's a bright guy. Alison and I have had our differences with him in the past. We thought he was, quite a lot too punchy in terms of trying to take people down who had the temerity to question the benefits of lockdown, as Alison and I did here on this podcast. But in a broad sense, I agree with you. I think Neil O'Brien is a very, very bright guy. He's got a lot of energy, and I do think he'll drive the policy process forward. But not wishing to put you in a spot, given that we're talking about your party leader here, but how can she really break through? As you know, I know Kemi pretty well, as does Alison. She's our constituency MP. Both Alison and I live in Saffron Walden. Now, Kemi's North Essex constituency, of course. But I think our sense is that she needs to worry less about parliamentary unity and keeping the sort of members of her parliamentary party who are a lot closer to the Lib Dems on side, and a lot more about coming up with policy definition that means she can challenge in the opinion polls. Because in the end, those on the left of your party, and the Tories always been a broad coalition, that's the tradition. If she's doing well in the polls, they will follow. They need to be led.
Yeah, look, I agree with you. And I think we're in a slightly different phase of her leadership now. I think she sort of started off trying to sort of consolidate things. And she said during the leadership campaign that she wasn't going to do things too quickly. She was going to set things up properly, think things through from first principles. And what you've seen over the last month, I would say, with the big welfare speech she gave, with Tory pressure really making a difference in Parliament on the government's welfare bill. And before that, she's already taken the party off its commitment to net zero. The reason for that is, yes, it's about things like household bills and energy security, but it's also about the fact that we need a completely different economic model. The process of deindustrialization that we've seen has been really catastrophic for the country. We need to reindustrialize. These are big changes. On immigration, she's confronted the failures of the party in opposition. And if you look at some of the detail of the things that the party's proposed by trying to amend legislation on immigration, some of the positions are pretty tough, such as extending indefinite leave to remain so that we can try to get some of the people who have come into the country in recent years out again, such as disapplying human rights laws as they apply to certain kinds of immigration decisions. So there actually has been a certain amount of change and substance, but I think we're likely to see much more of that in year two.
But I guess the question is, Nick, will your fellow MPs give her the time to develop these policies, not least after the upcoming local and Welsh and Scottish elections in May 2026? Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal. Nick, take it away.
This is from Chris. Dear Alison and Liam, thank you as always for that wonderful uplift on Thursday mornings that persuades your listeners that we're not in fact the ones going mad, but perhaps, just perhaps, are the ones that are sane. A friend of mine in South Africa who just about makes ends meet has sent me a photo of the entry clearance certificate, which he's helped his 85-year-old mother obtain for a visit to England to see her son and her grandchildren here. Their document cost £3,000, about £130, and she had to have her biometrics taken, prove she could support herself in Britain, and that she has a return ticket to South Africa, as well as providing details of activities that she'll be taking part in here. On the certificate, these words appear: no work or recourse to public funds, duration 180 days. I should add this elderly lady has a regular British surname and is a church-going Christian. Culturally, while staying with her family in England, she'll go to a couple of concerts and visit a couple of National Trust properties, as well as some open gardens. If she requires medical help, which is unlikely, her travel insurance or her son will cover the cost. The disconnect between the hoops that she has to jump through in order to arrive on our shores and the ease with which young men from completely different cultures are able to do so is deeply disturbing. Kind regards, Chris.
And this is from Steve. Alison and Liam, I've just read Alison's Manjaro journey in the paper, and I would like to say thank you. About a year ago, says Steve, approaching my 60th birthday, I was having similar health issues to Alison. Hearing about her experience starting on Manjaro gave me the confidence to start too. I lost 13 kilos and went down to a weight I haven't been since I was 30. Like Alison, I now feel like a different person, both physically and mentally. The food noise has gone. So thanks for going public and sharing your story, Alison. I'm sure you've helped many people, both men and women, and made a big difference to their health in the process. P.S. says Steve, how's Hamstring Halligan getting along? Back on the beers and barbecues while watching the Euros? Come on, Liam, us blokes can do it too. Why not team up with Boris and Clarkson and fight the flab? It would make a great podcast. Well, as it happens, Steve, let me just remind you, even though Alison shed a higher proportion of her body weight during the Great Planet Normal weight loss competition, Manjaro versus Liam's university era rowing machine, I actually lost more weight overall, and I've kept it off. Though you're right, I could lose at least one more stone. So thanks for giving me a public boot up the bum.
Well, there's no getting me off the beers and barbecues in this summer. This is from Stuart. Dear Alison and Liam, I'm relatively new to Planet Normal, having only recently found you. Where have they been?
Yeah.
But suffice to say, I'm now hooked on my weekly dose of sanity. I write regarding the so-called wealth tax that Labour is thinking about. Well, we already have one. A tax that bears no relationship to your ability to pay or the services you consume, one that's based on asset value, an asset that's been purchased out of post-tax income. It's called council tax. So it would be more correct to say Labour is looking at introducing another wealth tax. Keep up the good work, Stuart.
I think Stuart's right to focus on council tax. It could well be the focus of Reeves's autumn budget, Nick. I'm sure
Yes.
You share that suspicion of rebanding, which means that people in bigger houses, often cash poor, often quite elderly, pay a lot more each year. And finally, dear Alison and Liam, writes Richard, my weekly fix of Planet Normal is still a point of sanity amidst a turbulent world of madness. Your mix of insight and analysis, but also humour and step forward, Bob the Bard poetry is unique among podcasts. Well, I'm writing to you as Richard the Rhymer. Here's my poetic lament at the apparent hopelessness of finding a party I can vote for. And Nick, why don't you and I do alternative verses? You can start.
If you give Labour a poke, you'll find underneath they're still woke. And with Starmer and Reeves, who are thick and they're thieves, we can see that we'll all soon be broke.
From Westminster Green to East Coker, which of course is the village in Somerset, made famous by T.S. Eliot. From Westminster Green to East Coker, the Lib Dems get woker and woker. We'll jump back in bed with the EU, they said. And Sir Ed's at their head. He's a joker.
I can't read this bit. Next.
All right, I'll do this one, and then you do the next one. The Tories are now a spent force. Nick Timothy didn't want to be recorded saying, and that's probably fair enough. The Tories are now a spent force. They're way, way behind on the course. Might Kemi come good? I doubt that she could. So for now, I'm not backing that horse.
We all had high hopes for reform. This is not me, remember. Dear Nigel is always on form, but they're promising spending without any ending. It looks like another false dawn.
I'm not in the first flush of youth. This is Richard the Rhymer, of course, because I am Richard. I'm not in the first flush of youth. In fact, I'm quite long in the tooth. And through all of those years, just like now, it appears, no party has told us the truth.
I've never considered not voting. I've always been certain not floating. But when it's next time to put X on the line, I may decide not to vote, but go boating.
Boom, boom. I tell you what, Richard, you are giving Bob the Bard a run for his money. That is an excellent poem by Richard the Rhymer, a new kid on the Planet Normal block. And that's it from Planet Normal for another week. So we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reason views. Email of the week. Nick, why don't you choose?
Well, I think I have to reward the poetry, if not every line, so I would go with Richard.
Do you just want to distance yourself a little bit more from that verse about Kemi? Nick Timothy does not think the Tories are a spent force, okay? Though the reform verse that you did read out actually had quite a good aspect to it from a Tory's point of view, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Given all the spending that the Tories are claiming reform are now promising to their voters. So well done, Richard the Rhymer. You've done it. You've won the Planet Normal mug, send us an email at planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Put mug winner in the subject heading, give us your postal address, and we will send that rare as rocking horse poo Planet Normal mug to you.
If you enjoy Planet Normal, please subscribe to this podcast and leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen. It helps others to find us so the Planet Normal family can grow.
And as we speed away from Planet Normal and the matters of planet Earth comes back into view, thanks as ever to our producers Cass Ho, James Hodgson, Louisa Wells. Thanks of course to you, Nick Timothy, for being a great sport, for joining me here as a co-presenter on Planet Normal. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other, all of you. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.